Welcome to ACP. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments of the most critical issues. Whether you're new to the topic or need a refresher, I hope you will join us in our exploration of everything related to arms control. In this season, we offer primers on all the nuclear weapons arsenals currently existing in the world and their relationship to arms control. I hope it helps you better know a nuke.
By the 1980s, construction is well underway into what will ultimately become the beating heart of North Korea's nuclear fuel cycle facilities into the 1990s and the 2000s, a complex known as Nyongbyon, which has been at the heart of many a diplomatic negotiation involving North Korea and the West for the last 30 years.
DPRK suddenly lost two major patrons to some extent. At the same time, South Korea really took off by the Seoul Olympics in 1988. And then in military terms, the balance was shifting to South Korea. And so that period probably reinforced Kim Il-sung's thinking about the DPRK need to have its own nuclear weapons.
I don't really see that there is any scenario now in which North Korea would willingly give up its nuclear weapons, especially after having watched things like the fall of Gaddafi in Libya. Even recent events in Syria will probably work to reinforce the perception that nuclear weapons are required for the survival of the state.
Only one country has carried out nuclear tests in the 21st century, North Korea. This episode tackles the effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea's relationship with China, the tortured history of negotiations over the nuclear program, what we know and don't know about its arsenal today, and the debate over whether it is better to treat North Korea as a case of proliferation or a deterrence challenge. Guiding us through these issues are our guests, Ankit Panda, Dr Jingdong Yuan, and Dr Daniel Salisbury.
My name is Ankit Panda. I'm the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. My work on North Korea really almost dates back now more than a decade. In 2020, I published a book, Jong-Un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea, which attempted to synthesize not just the history of how North Korea came to field a credible nuclear deterrent, but also tried to synthesize and empathize with the North Korean view of its own threat environment and its thinking on nuclear strategy. The origins of North Korea's thinking about nuclear technology, like in the case of so many countries, really date back to the immediate years following the conclusion of the Second World War and the global fascination with nuclear technology per se. The founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, Kim Jong-Un, establishes an Atomic Energy Research Institute in 1952 to begin cultivating essentially some domestic technological basis for thinking about the role that nuclear technology could play for North Korea. Now, this is far before Kim is even thinking about building nuclear weapons per se, recognizing that to be a costly and technically complex endeavor. But that is essentially the origin. And as the Cold War develops, Kim Il-sung maintains a close relationship with the Soviet Union as a patron and a partner, the Soviet Union essentially being responsible for the establishment of North Korea in the very first place in the 1940s and certainly in the aftermath of the Second World War and the end of Japanese colonization on the Korean peninsula. By the mid-1960s, the Soviets have helped the North Koreans establish a small research reactor, the IRT-2000. The fuel supply for that reactor comes entirely from the Soviet Union, but this is the moment that North Korea's technical expertise with nuclear energy, with fission research, is beginning to accelerate. They're conducting independent experimentation at this time. As the Cold War continues, North Korea continues to sustain its interest in nuclear technologies. By the 1980s, construction is well underway into what will ultimately become the beating heart of North Korea's nuclear fuel cycle facilities into the 1990s and the 2000s, a complex known as Yongbyon, which has been at the heart of many a diplomatic negotiation involving North Korea and the West for the last 30 years. It's a name that you'll see in any number of news articles and academic articles on the subject. Yongbyon, that reactor is completed and goes critical in 1986, but in 1985, under Soviet pressure, North Korea joins the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Of course, the Soviet Union disappears. The loss of Soviet patronage for North Korea is in many ways a great tragedy. It's a huge shock to the regime. And this is precisely the moment where North Korea goes from really very clearly transitioning towards a latent interest in weaponizing nuclear technologies. The timeline is a little bit tricky here because you actually see the establishment of reprocessing facilities at Yongbyon before the Soviet Union formally collapses. And so the North Koreans have already started putting in some of the building blocks for reprocessing spent fuel, extracting plutonium for potential use in weapons. But by 1991, the U.S. intelligence community is rather convinced that the North Koreans are experimenting with the potential to build a nuclear weapon.
My name is Daniel Salisbury. I'm a visiting research fellow at King's College London and an associate fellow at RUSI. I've been studying nuclear issues now for about 15 years, mostly in different think tanks and research institutions in London and the UK. The Soviet collapse in the early 1990s was a massive blow to North Korea, but this also presented some opportunities for technology procurement, particularly in the missile space. There were obviously a lot of Soviet scientists that had previously had gainful employment from the state, and I think North Korea did try and snap some of these people up. Obviously, Russian traders and companies have contributed to the program since then, often without government consent. But a lot of the technology that North Korea has sought since the early 1990s has been from the international marketplace. There are a lot of companies that produce things that we call dual-use technology. These are goods that have both civil and military applications, and the nuclear technology, a lot of that obviously falls into this category, missile technology as well. And so North Korea has essentially been shopping from whatever sources it can to procure this technology from the 1990s onwards and continues to do so to this day.
My name is Jingdong Yuan. I'm currently the director of China-Asia Security Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Before that, I was a tenured faculty member at the University of Sydney. And before Australia, I was at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Joining the IEA, signing the document is one thing, but then you ratify the protocol because there's safeguard protocol that would allow the IEA to legitimately and regularly send inspectors to the declared nuclear facilities. So that happened in the early 1990s. IEA inspector detected discrepancies of what North Korea reported and what their technician would gather or surmise were really happening. But during this period of time, geopolitically, there were major big shock to North Korea because the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then China, after 15, 20 years of economic reform, was no longer willing just to give free economic assistance. So DPRK suddenly lost two major patrons to some extent. At the same time, South Korea really took off. I mean, by the Seoul Olympics 1988. And then in military terms, the balance was shifting to South Korea. And so that period probably reinforced Kim Il-sung's thinking about the DPRK need to have its own nuclear weapons. So that's probably when the covert activities started in Nyongbyon 5 megawatt research reactor facilities. So leading to the early 90s IEA inspection. So therefore you found the discrepancy. And then, of course, IEA had to report to the Security Council. So there was a tense period of time in the early 1990s.
Ankit Panda continues the story.
In the early 1990s, we enter a crisis because the United States has assessed that North Korea is carrying out activities inconsistent with its NPT obligations, and at the same time, North Korea is refusing to operate in good faith with the International Atomic Energy Agency to allow for the safeguards investigation that would be necessary to either conclude or confirm the assertions being made at the time. So this leads to a crisis in the first years of the 1990s. The North Koreans are given their own political system, the kinds of transparency mechanisms essentially that the NPT was seeking to impose on the country were just politically unacceptable to the North Korean leadership. But in 1991, the only nuclear weapons that were on the Korean peninsula were American tactical nuclear weapons. The Cold War ends, The United States and the Soviet Union under President George H.W. Bush and the final Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev conclude the unilateral presidential nuclear initiatives, whereby they pledged to pull back non-strategic nuclear weapons that were deployed outside of the borders of the Soviet Union and the United States. In 1992, North and South Korea include what is essentially the post-Cold War agreement that sets the tone for the broader objective of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I emphasize that latter part, the Korean Peninsula, because this is often forgotten in contemporary debates. So the 1992 Joint Declaration on the Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula sees the two Koreas agree to essentially not possess, develop, or operate anything related to nuclear weapons. And so it's an important baseline. It obviously has contemporary relevance. North Korea has, of course, violated it for more than 2 decades now, in effect. But meanwhile, as we see a growing debate in South Korea today about potentially acquiring nuclear weapons, this agreement continues to have relevance because South Korea has also ratified and agreed to forego nuclear weaponry. And this is an agreement in excess to South Korea's own NPT commitments as a non-nuclear weapon state. The North Koreans, under Kim Jong-Un in particular, have essentially declared this agreement to have no further relevance. This was an agreement that his grandfather agreed to in 1992. This was the lodestar for keeping North Korea tethered to its own commitment to relinquish nuclear weapons. But under Kim Jong-un, the North Koreans have essentially gone full steam ahead on developing nuclear capabilities and set aside the broader objective of the pledges made in 1992. The North Koreans very much have started to treat denuclearization in that same way, that it is a far-flung aspirational objective for North Korea that will depend on the United States, in turn, making commitments to also move towards denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which, given the U.S. nuclear force posture is essentially global in nature, is very unlikely to actually happen in a way that will address North Korea's security concerns. The agreed framework encounters several difficulties in the course of its implementation. First of all, the North Koreans recognize that American domestic politics are actually a pretty important constraint on the ability of an American president to make good on U.S. concessions. And so this was the time when the United States was supposed to be delivering heavy fuel oil to North Korea. There were delays to those shipments due to essentially opposition by Republicans in the U.S. Congress at the time to the agreement that the Clinton administration had agreed to. In the case of the U.S., that means 100% of U.S. nuclear weapons deployed to Asia were pulled back. And eventually in 1993, the U.S. and North Korea agreed to the denuclearization pledge as well. The NPT noncompliance crisis, the IAEA safeguards investigation crisis continues. There is the risk of the Clinton administration in 1994 contemplating potential military action against North Korea. There is a crisis that continues to accelerate. But due to diplomatic interventions, the two countries are able to ultimately agree to what at the time was a historic breakthrough and really a non-proliferation agreement without precedent, essentially. This was the 1994 agreed framework, whereby the United States and North Korea arrived at a simple bargain. North Korea would verifiably turn off essentially all plutonium reprocessing activity at Nyongbyon, all activities of weaponization concern at Nyongbyon. And in exchange, the United States would provide North Korea with heavy fuel oil to address the country's energy needs. The North Koreans, of course, maintained that their interest in nuclear technology was very much related to their domestic economic needs and energy needs. And at the same time, the United States would help set up a consortium to build light water reactors that would be more proliferation resistant, and also help North Korea with using nuclear energy peacefully, which of course is part of the NPT grand bargain, that non-nuclear weapon states will have access to peaceful nuclear energy. And so that is where things leave off in 1994. That freezes essentially North Korea's program for about 7 years on the fissile material side. But the agreed framework notably does not address delivery systems and ballistic missiles, which continue to be a lingering concern through the remaining part of the 1990s.
Because it was suspected that the DPRK could reprocess to distill weapons-grade plutonium. In return, the U.S. would enter into a process of normalization of diplomatic relations, and then also deliver light water reactors, because the DPRK at the time reject the allegation that they were pursuing nuclear weapons. They were pursuing nuclear power because North Korea was in dire need of electricity. So they said, okay, then we'll give you light water reactors, and we have this process. But unfortunately, several events took place. One was the 1994, right after the agreed framework, and then the Republican Party took over Congress, and then they did not want to give in the diplomatic wing. But afterwards, because the U.S. was organizing this Peninsula Nuclear Energy Organization, KETO, but actually South Korea was asked to foot the bill. So the calculation at the time, two light water reactor would cost $4 or $5 billion US. Then North Korea would reject a South Korea design of the light water reactor. So there was a back and forth. And then in 1997, suddenly the Asian financial crisis. Basically, suddenly major economic crisis, South Korea was not in a position to deliver. Then North Korea actually, in parallel, started during this covert uranium enrichment program all this time. Because they were in such a weak position, they just had to have all these insurance. And then the Bush administration came into power, started a review process, and then sent Jim Kelly to North Korea to challenge the North Korea. Then we have the second nuclear crisis. DPRK withdrew from NPT and expelled all the IEA inspectors and restart plutonium reprocess activities.
By 2002, two interesting things happened. The Bush administration declares North Korea to be part of an axis of evil, alongside, notably, Iraq and Iran. But at the same time, the administration is also in possession of intelligence showing that North Korea is amassing the capabilities to set up a uranium enrichment program. And that's an important distinction. They weren't actually enriching uranium at the time. The U.S. had very reliable intelligence that they were setting up the facilities to enrich uranium. The agreed framework did not have anything to say about uranium enrichment, right? The Bush administration, having received that intelligence, essentially concluded that North Korea was, if not violating the letter of the agreed framework, then certainly violating the spirit of that agreement. In October 2002, the United States confronts North Korea about this intelligence, arguing that North Korea was setting up a covert capability to enrich uranium. The North Koreans reject this. Later, the Bush administration invades Iraq. And that's actually very important because in my research and analysis, I conclude basically that the first 6 months of 2003 are precisely the moment when North Korea goes from a country that essentially is experimenting and looking at nuclear technology as a potential pathway to a nuclear weapons capability that could augment its security. You don't necessarily see the evidence that the North Koreans are all in, that they're putting the pedal to the metal in building up a nuclear capability. Kim Jong-il is proliferating missiles to other countries at this time, which is not something you'd really do if you wanted a credible nuclear capability to maximize the number of delivery systems that you had for your own needs. But what happens by the summer of 2003, a few months into the invasion of Iraq, is that you see everything change in North Korea. Kim Jong-il disappears from public view for what at the time I think was one of his longest disappearances, very disturbed by what had happened with the invasion in March. And by the way, that invasion began with a failed U.S. attempt to decapitate the Iraqi leadership. The U.S., on the basis of flawed intelligence, tried to kill Saddam Hussein with conventional missile strikes. This was publicly reported at the time, and so the North Koreans, having been named as part of an axis of evil with Iraq, are terrified. They essentially think they might be next in the line of fire, given everything that's happened with the collapse of the agreed framework and the Bush administration confronting them. By the summer of 2003, the North Koreans begin talking about nuclear weapons and deterrence in a meaningfully different way. And that is a pivot point where, in the North Korean mind, in Kim Jong-il's mind, nuclear weapons are no longer an experimental initiative that might lead to a capability someday that could contribute to the country's national defense. Nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence become the cornerstone of North Korea's national defense strategy and the key to the regime's survival longer term. Later in 2003, after the agreed framework collapses, after the start of the Iraq invasion, after North Korea begins talking about its nuclear capabilities in a different way, there is essentially a sense of the Bush administration that despite the agreed framework not being, in their view, the right way to address the problem, they did have to engage the North Koreans, that this was a problem that would need management. And also with the motivation of China, the countries in Northeast Asia, that's to say North Korea, South Korea, and Japan, with the addition of Russia and China, along with the United States, convened what come to be known as the Six-Party Talks to address not just the matter of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, but more comprehensive questions relating to the nature of the security architecture in Northeast Asia and North Korean security concerns more broadly. The six countries meet with different objectives. They're not aligned. The U.S. and its two allies are aligned, But this is essentially the venue through which, through 2009, the six countries try to address the fundamental underlying causes of North Korea's interest in nuclear weapons and insecurity in Northeast Asia. As the six-party talks continue, there are a number of obstacles. The United States in 2005, notably sanctions, Banco Delta Asia, an important node for North Korea's overseas illicit financial activities that results in a setback to the talks. But in 2006, the North Koreans detonate a nuclear device, becoming the first country in the 21st century to do so, and the first country to have withdrawn from the NPT to do fundamentally changing the nature of the proliferation challenge. And from there, the six-party talks do continue. There are agreements in 2005 and 2007 that, again, repledge to the denuclearization objective. But the six-party talks ultimately fail to fundamentally change and restrict North Korea's nuclear capabilities. The North Koreans do carry out performative dismantlement activities at Yongbyon. They demolish a cooling tower, for instance, at the 5-megawatt gas graphite reactor, but they're later able to reconstitute their cooling for that reactor with a different mechanism. The six-party talks, essentially, the effect that they have is they reduce the proximal North Korean fear in the 2000s that they would be attacked because of the involvement of the six countries in these talks, support by China in particular for the talks as well. But they also provide North Korea with the opportunity to engage diplomatically while the country continues to build up and move forward with the development of many of its capabilities.
But then in October 2006, the first nuclear test. And then there's a last effort in February 2007, again, an agreement to have a more detailed roadmap. But I think during that period of time, the Bush administration also introduced this idea of CVID, comparison, verifiable, irretrievable disarmament. You have to declare everything, so we have to have very rigorous inspection regime. North Korea wouldn't give the U.S. all of that. So six-party talks essentially collapsed in 2008. And then a few years later, Kim Jong-il was in serious health problems, and so nothing was going on except at Geneva or New York, some very lower-level negotiation. Kim Jong-un came into power in late 2011, and then there was another 3 years he had to follow the tradition of observing the elder passing away, so nothing happened. And then he was also consolidating the power. So one way of doing it is not only the purges, but also to return to this military first, but also parallel development, but also nuclear weapons development. But because there was nothing going on, so that allowed North Korea to continue gradually to build up the nuclear arsenal to some extent. So there are analyses about North Korea about how a country in such a economic dire strait and then sanctions by all sides could still, over all these 20 years, develop nuclear and missile capabilities. So again, it's the top leadership commitment and it's organizational structure, because they would have all for the civilian military organized institutional framework. They were very well coordinated. And then you would have all these front companies or all the DPRK overseas missions. They would engage in all these money laundering, illicit trafficking to get money, hard currency, and also to get the key parts and things to come back to North Korea. Of course, Pakistan played a very important role in trade off all of the AQ con. And certainly they put enormous resources there. And then over time, of course, they build up their own human capital, and then they accumulate all the key resource items. So now they have probably 60 or 70 nuclear devices. The degree of weaponization still is debatable. Nobody knows. But North Korea has that amount of nuclear weapons-grade fissile material that would be equivalent of Hiroshima and Nagasaki's side of nuclear warheads. But the next step would be, of course, you mate nuclear warheads to your delivery vehicles. So now that's why they also, over the last 10 years, have been testing lots of longer range missiles, also intermediate and short range missile. So they are moving ahead. But the world, the international community, there's no way North Korea has been engaged. And then there's no roadblocks in North Korean way. And then the UN sanctions have not been effective because if you sanction too much, that affect the people. So that creates a wicked problem. So the human side, so you can't have that kind of sanction. There are so many different loopholes. And then since North Korea has been building up its inventory and human capital, technology, knowledge, all of that. So now it's too late, really, to affect that part. So whatever you affect is more luxury goods or energy side or something, but these inevitably affect people more because DPRK would always allocate that part for the nuclear missile use. So it's well protected infrastructure there. So it's the only way is to acknowledge this is the reality, but how can we get to a point where North Korea will not start to engage in the proliferation activities, number one. Number two, maybe freeze or halt is the expansion of the nuclear arsenal. And third, to have some mutual understanding that they will not be using nuclear weapons. Because if you look at the nuclear doctrine in North Korea, DPRK, until 2015, they were talking about the North Korean version of no first use, right? So there was a very ambiguous language. But then after 2016, so the nuclear weapons, they were written in the Constitution, and Kim Jong-Un also made all these statements to rely on a massive force. So basically blurring everything together, which could include nuclear weapons in the first use package. So Trump won the first round in 2018, 2019, start the process. So there was lots of symmetry, lots of diplomacy, but was not really a well thought out plan because summit meeting really do not normally resolve things. They sign off, they photo always display the painstaking, slow negotiation before for the leader to sign. I think even there, one similar mistake made was to seek one off. So basically, the deal Trump reported offers if you have full declaration, full disarmament, and then we will be very happy all of that. Because again, similarly to China, North Korea is very careful in thinking about the economic benefits, what that can bring to the political situation in North Korea. If you allow people's lives to improve, if you open up a little bit, reform a little bit, as China has tried to convince North Korea this is a good way, but it has not convinced Kim Jong-un. And because he sees the risk, so therefore he's very tilted toward securing the regime security first and foremost. So in that regard, nuclear missiles are critical variable to ensure the regime, even though the U.S. would say there's no attempt for regime change. But even by engaging, allowing North Korea to be back into the international community with a post-threat to the Kim regime, because the change on the ground, opening up, or comparison, all of that, so that could be a recipe for regime collapse or people start to doubt.
From around 2016, the sanctions really changed in nature, and we started to see a lot more sectoral economic sanctions. And so this was things like provisions that prevented North Korea from importing oil, from selling coal, from selling things like textiles and seafood, and basically anything that was believed to raise revenue for the program. Since that point as well, we've had a lot more focus, particularly in the Kim Jong-un era, so from the early 2010s onwards, in building a missile program that's capable of carrying these weapons. North Korea has been pursuing ballistic missile technology in some form or other since the late 70s. It was really in this period in the 2010s that the program started to bear fruit. And in 2017, North Korea successfully tested a first intercontinental ballistic missile. This was obviously designed to pose nuclear threats to the United States. But also on top of this, they pursued a range of different shorter range systems, some of which will be nuclear capable as well. And it was really when this ICBM capability was first showcased in 2017 that Kim Jong-Un essentially declared that the country had a kind of complete nuclear capability. The most interesting development of the past couple of years has been the unveiling of the centrifuge facilities. We have known that North Korea has had an interest in centrifuges for 20 years. Segeka, the former director of Los Alamos, was able to visit one of these facilities in 2012 and was able to report back on what he saw. But in the past 12 months, we've had a couple of instances, including in January 2025, where Kim Jong-un has been photographed walking around these facilities. It gives open source analysts a little bit of an insight into what's going on in the program and what kind of capabilities the centrifuge program might have. The centrifuge program and its capacity really has been a real challenge in estimating the size of North Korea's material stockpiles and the size of its arsenal. Given that we can see developments at the nuclear reactor and at Yongbyon and the reprocessing facility for space, we've been able to have rough parameters of the amount of plutonium produced, whereas the centrifuge program until recently has really been a black box. We've seen very little information about technology flowing into the program. Having this insight now, although we don't know how many facilities there are, perhaps gives us a little bit of a sense of the scale of North Korea's uranium material holdings and how many warheads this could potentially be used for. I've seen estimates anywhere from sort of 35 to 65, but it requires a lot of assumptions and a bit of maths. Some estimates place it in 100 or more, but I think those are really quite high-end estimates. Obviously, we don't know the efficiencies with which the North Koreans are able to manipulate the material, and we don't really know much about their warhead production complex at all. The other big issue that we don't really know a lot about is what is on the front end of North Korea's missiles. We've seen increasing numbers of tests of different types of systems. We've got multiple ICBMs, a lot of great developments with solid fuel. We've got testing of ballistic missile submarines, testing of cruise missiles, testing of hypersonic weapons. But the front ends of those ICBMs, they're quite large. There are some people who probably say that it's not going to survive re-entry into the atmosphere. There are probably other people who believe that they're looking at not necessarily merging, but putting multiple warheads on the front end of the missile, penetration aids and decoys. But when some of those ICBMs, you've got something the size of a transit van on the front, you've got a little bit of space to play with some of these options.
Now we are in this situation 30 years after the Great Framework, and all the lessons you can think of is, number one, there has not been great power coordination. It's always the North Korea issue is no longer a non-proliferation issue. The international community is a public good if we can resolve this. It's more becoming a pawn in the great power rivalry in that regard. Number two, all the parties have different interests involved, and then there's no consistency there. So now basically a small problem now is becoming a bigger problem. The bigger the problem, the more reluctant the U.S. really becomes. We need to give more to get something which is North Korean should be, as a member. So that's very bad in a situation. But then there's no way out of it. You can't wish. So somehow to get the dialogue, some conversation, to understand North Korean. Because my point is always let North Korea put down the demands. And then perhaps you can just go halfway, meet some. But then to have a reciprocal arrangement, because how the U.S. deploys all the means or international community to get to the end goal, that's very important, right? So the goals would justify a lot of the means. When you need to be flexible, you need to even be making concessions, and then you have to do it for the better, the more important thing. There need to be some new innovative ways of thinking about how to get U.S. China to engage in a meaningful dialogue. So the U.S. probably will have to think also through a bigger political context to thinking about all their relationship linkages. It can no longer just dismiss those. But at the same time, somehow the U.S. needs to convince where China can benefit from a nuclear risk reduction dialogue without compromising even the political interest, just from the purely functional, very more specific military aspect.
The last real effort to try and engage North Korea was seen by the Trump administration. He talked about imposing maximum pressure. There was an era of fire and fury where both sides were making threats at each other, and then eventually a series of summits, which didn't really achieve very much beyond a bit of a photo opportunity, to be honest. The main problem for sanctions to have an impact, you really have to have opportunities for meaningful diplomacy. You have to have space for compromise or agreement. Especially since Kim Jong-Un has taken power, he has really started pumping resources into the missile program. The idea of denuclearization has really been getting further and further away. I don't really see that there is any scenario now in which North Korea would willingly give up its nuclear weapons, especially after having watched various things like the fall of Gaddafi in Libya. Even recent events in Syria will probably work to reinforce the perception that nuclear weapons are required for the survival of the state. With sanctions, though, there's always been the kind of issues with sanctions evasion and sanctions busting. The amount of pressure that sanctions are able to impose on a target really depend on their ability to cut this target off from the financial system and to inflict pain and suffering, not just on the state as a whole, but also on the leadership. And with North Korea, they have been largely cut off from the global financial system since the 1970s when they defaulted on their debts. They're very adept in sanctions evasion and using illicit networks to raise revenue, to move things, to procure goods. The UN sanctions coming in 2006 was definitely not the beginning of this expertise. And also the structure of the state itself means that it's very difficult to inflict pain on the leadership. The wider population is obviously suffering, not just because of sanctions, but because of the dire economic situation, food shortages, all that kind of stuff. But the leadership has managed to really put themselves at arm's length from the impacts of sanctions. They have even set up networks to procure things like luxury goods that fuel the core economy and the patronage in the country and keep the whole regime afloat. And the amount of infrastructure that they've built to bypass sanctions, to respond to them, is really impressive. And because of this, it's really nullified the ability of the sanctions to cut through, affect state decision making, and also to get the country and the leadership to renounce a capability that is now so intertwined into its national security and its existence. That is why sanctions have failed. The program is large, it's expanding, the number of warheads and amounts of fissile material are expanding, the missile arsenal is expanding, the missile complex to build that arsenal is expanding. And it has become truly and deeply ingrained with the North Korean security state to a degree that I think it would be really foolish to think that we can roll this back at this point. There is obviously a prospect that the Trump administration and maybe even future administrations in the US will try to pursue this. But we're getting to a point now whereby we're going to have to learn to accept and learn to live with North Korea as a nuclear power. The question now becomes about how do we try and integrate North Korea into existing arrangements and discussions in a way that really prioritizes risk reduction and also ensuring that we find ways to ensure that North Korea is deterred and hopefully in ways that also tries to minimize the risk of escalation.
Ankit Panda shares his insights into obstacles for nuclear arms control on the Korean Peninsula to conclude our episode.
When we talk about arms control and the Korean Peninsula, there's a fundamental question that first has to be answered, which is North Korea a non-proliferation problem, or is it a deterrence problem? A deterrence problem being one that can be addressed with arms control. My view is that it's the latter. The view of policymakers in the United States and South Korea and Japan is that it necessarily must be the former because of the potential reputational and precedent-setting implications of moving away from a non-proliferation-centered approach to North Korea. Since 2017, it's been very clear in the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community and the intelligence assessments of other countries that North Korea has a credible capability to deliver nuclear weapons to South Korea, Japan, to the continental United States. And so, given that reality, there is this tension about, do you emphasize denuclearization and nonproliferation as the United States has since the early 1990s, or does the United States recognize that the fundamental driving principle of its policy should be to reduce the risks of nuclear war through miscalculation, misperception? You are starting to see signs that the United States is centering North Korea's nuclear capabilities and the possession of nuclear weapons as the primary concern and the primary threats to its security. The Biden administration's nuclear employment guidance, which came out in 2024, speaks of North Korea in the same paragraph as Russia and China, right? That's not an accident. North Korea is the third nuclear-armed adversary of the United States capable of ranging the homeland. And so there is a natural basis here to begin thinking about arms control. There are obstacles, though, which is that South Korea and Japan continue to be unpersuaded of this approach. The overwhelming emphasis in South Korea, particularly under the outgoing conservative administration, given the political crisis there in December 2024, was very much focused purely on deterrence to manage the North Korea challenge. The preceding progressive administration was a lot more positively disposed towards arms control. There was, in September 2018, a comprehensive military agreement signed between the two countries, which aimed to basically diffuse the conventional triggers to a crisis that could very quickly get to a point where North Korea's threshold for nuclear use could be met. These are the fundamental questions that policymakers will have to wrangle with going forward. The other part of this is, of course, the North Korean perspective on these issues, which has changed quite a bit in the last few years. After the collapse in 2019 of the diplomatic summit in Hanoi, Vietnam, between the United States and North Korea, where the North Koreans offered parts of the reprocessing and enrichment infrastructure at Nyongbyon in exchange for U.S. sanctions relief. After that failed, the North Koreans have been rather determined to not engage with the United States. My belief is that they are waiting for evidence that the United States is actually reframing the fundamental principles that guide its policy towards North Korea, away from denuclearization to potentially something resembling arms control. Implicit in an arms control approach would be the idea, essentially, that the North Koreans would possess some nuclear capability going forward, right? The basis for arms control, which fundamentally depends on mutual interest between the two parties that might engage in arms control, is that you don't go to the arms control table hoping for the other side to turn over the keys to its nuclear arsenal. You understand that you both have security interests that can be ameliorated through a cooperative process of negotiated diplomacy, essentially. The North Koreans, I think, are waiting for that sign. It's unclear if that sign will manifest, but the basis in the United States under the second Trump administration for a potential change is quite strong, and not just for reasons having to do with the Trump administration's idiosyncratic approach to a number of diplomatic and strategic questions. It's fundamentally the fact that the U.S. national interest now overwhelmingly points in the direction of treating North Korea as a deterrence problem, where the risks of deterrence can be bounded through arms control and risk reduction as tools.
Thank you for listening, and to our guests and the European Union's Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding the series. Until next time, stay optimistic.